With 4.2 second half coming up and the rerun of Sunday also being soon, today I'm here with the should you or should you not summon for him. We're going to be going over his spot in the meta and how he's kind of held up and what he kind of does now. Also a specific section to get the word out there that Dan Heng and Sunday synergy does not work as you think, and it really needs its own section, which is the whole reason this is its own video, because it is just a very common misconception. And then finally, reasons why you should or should not summon. If you're interested in the other rerun characters, I do have a video dedicated to them that you can check in the pinned comment. I just wanted to get this video out specifically for Sunday just because this misconception that we'll talk about after his spot is something that really needs to be spread, because it was kind of advertised that this is how it works and it ended up not being the case. So we will get into that. It's a very important thing to know. Stuck grinding in Honkai Star Rail? Need Stellar Jades fast? We've got you covered. Head over to U7 Buy, your ultimate gaming hub for save fast and cheap in-game top-ups. Whether it's Star Rail or your other favorite games, U7 delivers instantly and players love it. Check out their Trustpilot reviews, they're actually top ranked. On the Honkai Star Rail direct top-up page, you can recharge your account in seconds. For example, 8080 Ononeric shards cost $99.99 in the official store. However, on U7 Buy, you can see the price is cheaper. When you head over to U7 Buy, you might notice that the storefront display prices currently match the in-game store, but don't worry, the magic happens at checkout. Once you click the buy now button, your total instantly drops to our actual discounted price only. Just pick your server, enter UID, pay securely, and boom, your account is instantly loaded. Want extra savings? Use code PRETSR at checkout for 5% off, perfect for last minute pulls, battle passes, or surprising a friend. And here's a bonus. If you spend $80 a month on U7 Buy, you can grab the Honkai Star Rail Express Pass for only 1 cent, which is nearly free. Click on the link in my description, recharge fast, save more, and keep blazing those trails. So first, let's go over Sunday's spot in the meta. So Sunday released in 2.7. He had a very interesting release because he was really good at the time since there wasn't many options. Sparkle kind of just had like a active debuff of being 50% action advance while not having like the craziest amp. Still better overall, but just not as much to warrant not having a -1 on a lot of characters. The only thing that really gave competition was Bronya with her E2 setup, because her E2 setup is still to this day very good. But also since Sunday was actually able to action advance summons. At the time, this wasn't really a big thing because the only ones that actually got that benefit of getting their summons advanced was mainly just Jingwan, who was also pretty bad. Could do it for Hypercarry Topaz, which also wasn't great, and then Hypercarry Link Shot for Crit Shot at the time. I guess that was alright. But in general, he was just a good generalist to have around. Any character that really needed a -1 or wanted to have a -1, you would be able to use Sunday there. You were able to even throw him on someone like Bootil's team, since it completely disregarded any issue of skill points, because Sunday with his light cone becomes skill point positive. At base, he is skill point neutral, and then with his light cone becomes positive while also having a smooth energy rotation for 3-turn ultimate. So on any team where you kind of use these action advancers, that's kind of where Sunday would actually end up having his places. A very common setup back then was Sunday, Robin, and then Popo, and the main value about Sunday was kind of future potential. We did have an idea that the summon meta was coming, which was going to be later translated to Memo Sprites, and Sunday would be the premier support for that, you would think, with how he works. His damage buff is gated by not having the full value unless the character has a summon. His E1 has a very small defense shred that's very big for the summon. So we going into the summon meta would assume that Sunday would be completely valuable and would be one of the most valuable characters you can pull from. If you were around during that time of Sunday's release, you definitely heard and thought probably that Sunday was going to be very valuable. Fast forward a bit, the next update actually, we get Aglia in the second half, and it was proven that Sunday, oh my god, he's going to be insane for these characters because he wanted to run Sunday with Aglia. They had perfect synergy, her Memo Sprite being the summon, quote unquote, activates full buffs, the joint attacks work perfectly for the actual E1 as well. Energy was also important, but that was it. Then we got Castris, who had anti-synergy because the full skill buff would disappear when you blew up the dragon, and the ult uptime was horrible because all the stuff that was regarding the summon would be gone when you blew up the dragon. You'd have to use the buff while the dragon was up to keep it up. So it was very minimal buffs and didn't really impact the dragon, especially since Castris had a better playstyle of either having the dragon explode instantly or actually keeping it out. But in general, it didn't work properly. Then the Remembrance team got more and more characters, and it was very safe to assume Sunday was just going to have no spot. He just didn't work for the main DPS, and then also the other one that could be ran as a main DPS, being Evernight later on, also could not use it. The only one that could on that team really was just Hyacine. And I guess to an extent, Cyrene. But you're focusing on mainly Castris, and if not her, Evernight. Both of them cannot do it. And as I mentioned, E2 Bronya setups were already very competitive. The only reason people didn't really use it because even though it was slightly better than Sunday usually for most characters, is because it was just more harder to manage. Sunday was just a very comfortable support, which he still is, and his value was pretty nice for a lot of players because he's very simple to use. You just build a -1, he really doesn't make you have problems with uptime or skill points. Energy stuff was nice, the extra crit rate was great for actually builds on your DPS, like if you were to use him on a character that released later, like a Noxa or then Finon, you're able to build him to 80% crit rate, which allowed you to focus on a lot of other stats, which was good. And then on characters like a Noxa with the energy, or just anyone that could use normal energy, very beneficial, mainly for Aglia. That's the one that benefited the most because she really wants that energy. So because the idea of him being the next like must pull support kind of just died because of the Mono Remembrance team not wanting him, that kind of impacted his value. While again, he was still usable with characters like Anoxa, Maide before Cyrene, and also Finon, and still is pretty commonly used with Finon. It was really annoying because a lot of his value was locked behind having a summon. So you'd be missing out on the full damage effect from his skill, you'd be missing out on any extra buff from the E1. Then we go to 3.6 with the release of Permansor Terrae Dan Heng. But I want to talk about Sunday a little more before we get into the misconception with that unit. Mainly all that's left to say is from then to now, and I'm saying now as in 4.2, so all of 3.x and then the bit of 4.x, he's more of a comfortable generalist that has spots on teams. However, there's just a lot of better options. Like again, that E2 Bronya setup always existed, and Sparkle got her Nova Flare, which straight up made it to where running a base speed DPS with a hyperspeed Sparkle, which is what you always did, ended up being better because her amp is just that damn good. And especially since Sparkle has better investment than Sunday. Her E1's better, her E2 is, my god, leagues beyond Sunday's. And yeah, you were able to run a base speed DPS, you didn't have to focus on getting any speed, so you could just fully focus on damage stats. So yeah, Sparkle getting a Nova Flare very much took a hit on Sunday. Even characters where you think Sunday would permanently stay, like Saber, ended up really being not the case. Like Sparkle actually ended up being better for Saber just because the damage amp is so good. Alright, but now let's talk about the post-release of Permansor Terrae Dan Heng. This segment really needs to go into why this doesn't work as you think. However, I do want to say it does work to an extent to where it's still good and an actual thing, but a lot of people think it works fully when it comes to these characters' buffs together, Sunday's buffs being fully activated, but it doesn't as you think. First, I want to say a big shout out to a channel named Vosh. I will link their video to this actual problem. Vosh is known to debunk this kind of stuff in a very in-depth format. I'm going to do this as a very general way for anyone to understand, so I'm not going to go into depths with values and stuff or anything. I'm just going to explain this in a way you can understand easily without needing to know anything. But I definitely recommend checking out Vosh if you want more info on why it doesn't work, such as how certain stuff like summons are tagged. Anyway, so the whole thing was Sunday has a bunch of buffs locked behind a character having a summon. A lot of characters he was used with don't have a summon. Jingwan is like the only one and that is dead, and the only other one that actually was meta was Aglia. Dan Heng came in and he was able to dedicate some teammate as a bondmate, usually always would be the DPS. Character that is bondmate now has Dan Heng's Soul Dragon, and you were able to activate Sunday's buffs. People were under the impression that both E1 and Sunday's skill fully affected Soul Dragon itself as well, which is why you'd see more damage buffs than not, so it looks a bit misleading, but this is where the problem comes in. When you do dedicate a teammate as bondmate and attach the Soul Dragon to them, and you are to use Sunday's skill on them, yes, the actual character themselves, so the one that has the bondmate buff, is fully going to get that 80% damage dealt effect rather than just the bit when they don't have a summon. However, the Soul Dragon itself actually does not get it. It's just a weird way on how it is considered and how it is coded, so it is only really there for the actual character to gain the full damage buff effect, while Soul Dragon is still just doing its damage based off whatever scaling it does have based off the bondmate. That's one big thing. And another thing is the E1. The big idea that this would allow the actual dragon to fully ignore all defense, that the E1 did provide, so up to 40% for all its hits. That is also not the case. From basic wording, I want to just explain this because there's some people that actually would think this. Under no circumstance the actual character themselves will ever have the 40% defense shred. The only way it kind of applies is to joint attacks, since it is the Memo Sprite also attacking, so I'm just going to say Aglia's enhanced basic attack. That's kind of the only case where it's kind of applicable, but for a character that is a summon, there's no time where the actual wearer themselves, or the owner in this case, would have that full 40%. That's obvious if you just read it, but I just want to mention it. But now the actual wonked thing. So the actual character you buff, so the one that's holding Soul Dragon, will always have the 16% defense shred, which is how it's worded. You would assume that Soul Dragon would be able to ignore 40% of the target's defense, as it does state. However, also due to weird coding, more than half the Soul Dragon's attacks are completely unaffected by this. But on the final hits that are morally considered additional procs of damage, that is the one that's actually going to be getting the effects from the skill and the E1. So a bunch of the hits are completely unaffected, no damage from the actual skill, no shred. And then the additional procs, once they do happen, that's when you get the actual effect, which is just 2 of the hits, I think, from what I remember correctly. So there is a lot of missed damage, and this is a very huge misconception that people do need to know. And that's why I want to have this whole segment dedicated to it, because it is just very important to know. Again, if you want to understand it fully in depth on why this happens and just how it is because of Star Rail's coding, please do sure to check out the description and check out Vash's channel. I will have the exact video linked, which will take you over everything you do need to know in order to fully understand it, as he does cover it in very big depth. Now, just a little follow-up segment to that. Just because it doesn't work as properly as you think doesn't mean it's completely useless. Like, you still do get the full damage percent for the actual holder of bondmates, so they're going to be doing more damage, so that's an additive benefit. At least the Soul Dragon gets some of the effect. Like, it's not all of it. A bunch of it is missing, unfortunately. It could do way more damage if it worked properly. However, it's still something. And then you also have Sunday being able to action advance the Soul Dragon, which is really good for sustaining potential from Dawning, because it gets to act more, and also more damage when it is enhanced. So I'm not trying to disregard this synergy entirely. It is just something that many people don't know, and I also do want to try to get it out there so more people are more aware of it. But again, I'm not completely disregarding the synergy. It's still technically a good synergy because it works in more ways that would be an additive benefit as opposed to using another generic sustainer. But finally, reasons why you should or should not summon. To be completely honest, Sunday's value isn't necessarily that high right now, but it's not to say he is a completely worthless character. If you're using characters that do want to have -1 setups, that changes depending on who you're running. And hypercarry setups in general, Sunday is still good, especially for more casual players that don't want to go into the E2 Brony setup, especially because he just provides a lot, the energy, the crit rate. That stuff makes it a lot more comfy to build, especially if you have the light cone where skill points become completely no problem unless you have a character that's super skill point hungry. So having hypercarry setups with Sunday is still fine. Another reason is if you're an Aglia player. I know like recent calcs and stuff when Cyrene came out was saying RMC is better. Personally, I think Sunday just does perform more consistent, and Sunday is just really valuable for what he does provide to Aglia specifically, especially since the stuff that he does actually does work with her with how she works. So if you just use Aglia in general, I highly recommend Sunday. But otherwise, it would just be if you're in need of a support that is able to do this -1 setup, because if you're doing a hyperspeed setup for a base speed DPS, you will always, and I mean always, be better off just using Sparkle. So it's only specifically for -1 now until maybe Sunday gets a Noble Flare later. But yeah, for now, it's only if you're going for that -1 setup and you want that additive comfort. That's kind of the only reasons why I would summon for him. Reasons to not summon for him would of course be the direct opposite. If you don't use Aglia, then you don't really need to consider him for that. If you have -1 setups, but maybe you're doing the Bronya setup already, she honestly works just as fine, if not better. If you want to do base speed DPS with hyperspeed setups and you have Sparkle, then you'd be using Sparkle instead, because she will always be better. And also, if you're someone heavy into Elation, your pulls would be better invested into Elation characters themselves, because unfortunately, Sunday is pretty worthless when it comes to them, because there's not much he's doing for them, unfortunately. Like, Evanescia, who's the upcoming character, would get some form of benefit, but it's not worth running over the many options she does have otherwise. So yeah, specifically for Elation, which is the main topic right now, that is also not going to be recommended. So if you're not really in need of those -1 setups because you already have one going, or maybe you use teams that don't need the -1 at all, or you're interested in doing more base speed and hyperspeed support, or you're more interested in doing a base speed DPS with a hyperspeed support, in that case, you're much better off pulling Sparkle. And that is the should you summon video for Sunday, going over his place in meta from when he released to now, talking about the big misconception of him and Permansor Terrae donning, and then reasons why you should or should not summon. You can see how this video is practically longer than the other two, which had 2 units, because this misconception is something that really needs to be explained. That is why I have its own dedicated video. But anyway, if you did find this video helpful, dropping a like would be greatly appreciated. If you're new to the channel or haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for future videos like this, along with all other tips of Star Wars content. And I'll see you later. Peace out.